Welcome to Phnom Penh, a bustling city characterized by rapid growth and expansion. With its eyes firmly focused on the future, whatever that may hold, the city is in danger of forgetting its past, especially its past as an outpost of the French Colonial Empire.
This film is part of a larger discussion of the impact of imperialism on the cities of Southeast Asia. We might forget that colonialism, born of conquest and maintained through various social injustices, structured many of the cities around the world.
It is only by understanding this colonial past that we can come to appreciate the cultural and historical heritage of some of Southeast Asia's greatest cities.
This cultural heritage is in danger of being lost to the forces of Southeast Asia's modernization and its dynamic growth. Sadly, the path to the future seems to lie through the destruction of the past.
Phnom Penh provides a fascinating case study for exploring colonial cities, especially as the colonial era is sandwiched between two other periods in Cambodian national history. Indeed, the glories of the Khmer Empire tend to outshine the colonial history, and the horrors of the Khmer Rouge cast a shadow upon this time period, thus making colonial Phnom Penh really the story of a lost city.
When faced with the incomprehensible scale of human suffering under the Pol Pot regime, scholars have neglected other areas in Cambodian history. Some may ask, why study colonial cities? And there are several good answers to this question. Architects and preservationists might point to preserving cultural heritage and admiring beautiful buildings, such as the National Archives here in Phnom Penh. On a practical note, today's city managers would benefit from an understanding of urban plans laid down by colonial officials. Also, there is a basic historical interest in knowing what a city looked like in a specific era. Certain businesses, such as the FCC or the Raffles hotel chain, specialize in satisfying that curiosity.
Other more critical voices point to the danger of studying colonial cities, the danger of taking us down the path of colonial nostalgia. Penny Edwards and Pani Vong Narinder have used the term Indo-Chic to criticize this form of colonial nostalgia in the former French Indochina.
Such history can glamorize the past and whitewash the fact that colonies were the product of imperialist wars of aggression. Such pitfalls can be avoided by adopting the perspective of critical empire studies, an examination of the colonial past that can both appreciate architectural achievements but never forgets colonialism's serious injustices and crimes.
As Joseph Conrad wrote, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking away from those with a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a very pretty thing when you look into it too much.
Studying colonial cities and colonial architecture requires a bit of a balancing act. To appreciate colonial architectural achievements is not to condone or endorse the imperialist system that produced them.
Thus, under the double threat of modernization's wrecking ball and historical amnesia, Phnom Penh's colonial past is in danger of becoming the history of a lost city.
Long before the French Empire built Phnom Penh into a colonial city, Cambodia had an impressive urban past under the Khmer Empire.
The glorious Khmer Empire of the 9th to 15th century is one of the great civilizations of world history, enjoying both economic and cultural achievements that remain stunning to this day.
The empire benefited from a geography that favored both agriculture and trade.
But most importantly, the Khmer learned to tame the waters that flooded the land every monsoon season, building massive reservoirs called barai that both stored water and controlled the flood.
This water then could be used to grow wet rice in a sophisticated agricultural system, producing 2 to 3 crops a year and supporting a massive population.
Angkorian cities ranged in size, but perhaps the best example is Angkor Thom, which was established by Jayavarman VII. According to the associated infrastructure, including the central temple itself of the Bayon, as well as the surrounding environment, it's approximately 35 square kilometers in area. In terms of the inscriptional evidence that we have available, there were supposedly tens of thousands of personnel attached to a specific temple at one time. There has been extensive debate as to what eventually caused the collapse of the Angkoran Empire. However, most theories have focused primarily on a combination of environmental factors as well as political processes. Most of the environmental theories have focused on a combination of climatic change as well as the failure of the hydraulic system to support the burgeoning empire. In addition, other factors have included invasions from foreign armies as well as an opportunistic move towards the coast where there's trading opportunities available.
While not entirely abandoned, the glory days were gone, with most buildings falling into decay and soon swallowed up by the voracious Southeast Asian jungle.
In the early 1400s, a Thai invasion forced the court to flee western Cambodia, establishing a new capital in the market town of Phnom Penh.
Once, possibly in the year 1431, a massive koki tree floated down the Mekong River, coming ashore here, where the Mekong meets the Tonle Sap. In this legend, a member of the local aristocracy, a certain Lady Pen, found 4 statues of the Buddha nestled inside the tree. In honor of this miraculous event, she ordered the construction of a hilltop wat, or Buddhist stupa. In time, a small town grew around the hill, taking the name Phnom Penh, or Lady Pen's Hill.
After a few decades, the court once again moved its capital to nearby Udong, demoting Phnom Penh's political importance. But thanks to its location, the city never lost its economic role.
Due to the geographical advantage of being along the Tonle Sap River, the Mekong River, and the Basok River further to the south, Phnom Penh was a natural commercial hub. So the question obviously arises, how did this small town in a relatively poor part of Southeast Asia come under French rule? Why did the French first come here? What were their dreams and schemes? And how did this small town around Lady Pen's Hill become a French city?
The answer lies not in Cambodia, but in China.
The French are interested not so much in the land of Cambodia as gaining control of the mighty Mekong River. Jealous of the fabulous wealth the British Empire was amassing in China, primarily due to its opium trade between India and China, the French were eager to crack the Chinese market. In particular, they were interested in getting to Yunnan in the interior of China, which they believed to be a source of cheap raw silk. They thus began to fantasize about going up the Mekong River to find this backdoor to China.
In 1863, the French encouraged the Cambodian monarch to sign a treaty making his kingdom a French protectorate. Historians still debate if he really understood what he was getting himself into.
In 1866, the admirals in Saigon sent a mission up the Mekong River, hoping to open up a new French-controlled route to China. The mission was a spectacular failure.
Half the expedition died, including its commanding officer, who had previously been in charge of Phnom Penh. All they proved was that the Mekong was not fit for navigation once it passed into Laos. With the failure of the Mekong to China scheme, what would be Phnom Penh's future as a French colonial city? Recognizing the city's role as a regional bazaar, the French decided that this economic center should also be a political center.
In the 1860s, the French encouraged the royal court to move the palace from Udong here to Phnom Penh.
The city was once again the capital of Cambodia. Colonial urban planning gave Phnom Penh its shape and feel as a city.
The first French visitors to Phnom Penh were rather unimpressed. While they did admit it was a thriving market center, they were not particularly inspired by the collection of small wooden houses and few floating markets that made up the town.
Thanks to the monsoon rains, the city was subject to annual floods, and well into the 1880s, the French reportedly had to travel about the city by boat, making it seem undeveloped and undesirable. Traditional Khmer construction, as elsewhere in Southeast Asia, dealt with such environmental issues as flooding by building wooden houses on stilts that raised their inhabitants above the annual floodwaters. The French deemed such construction backwards and set about modernizing the city along Western lines. In the colonial vision, modernity should not make accommodations with nature, but use technology to defeat nature. Colonial urban design in Phnom Penh reflected both the conquest of the land and the people of Cambodia.
After the 1884 fire, which destroyed over 100 shophouses and burned down scores of wooden payots in the central market area, the French decreed that all new construction would not be in wood, but must now be in brick. This would prevent fires, but it also came to symbolize the power and permanence of French colonial modernity. Economically, it created a boom in brick factories just outside the city limits of Phnom Penh.
As Paris's state-sponsored Beaux-Arts school determined that the neoclassical style would dominate French architecture in the late 19th century, the style was exported to the colonies. Phnom Penh's new buildings were impressive in scale and decoration.
The classic colonial city divided urban space by racial categories, establishing quarters or neighborhoods for different ethnic groups. So this map from 1912 clearly marks this area as the European quarter, this area as the Chinese quarter, this as the quarter of the royal palace, this as a quarter for Cambodian villages, and this as a quarter for further Asian city growth.
Each quarter or neighborhood had its own feel and a very different style of construction. The European quarter contained government offices and commercial enterprises, such as banks, as well as French residential space.
The aspect of the French colonial building in Cambodia, the louver window, the height of the ceiling, the open plan, because it's really good for the ventilation for this hot climate country like Cambodia.
Thanks to their comparative wealth in the colony, French civilians enjoyed a much higher standard of living than they would have enjoyed back in France. This can be seen in the elaborate villas they constructed.
These spacious villas stood in sharp contrast to the more modest Khmer wooden structures and Chinese shophouses. These contemporary rural Cambodian homes are similar to what Phnom Penh's Khmer residents would have inhabited.
The Chinese neighborhood was dominated by the shophouse style of architecture, where the ground floor would serve for commercial activity and the upper floors would provide residences. By combining both workspace and living space in the same structure, this guaranteed that the population density in the Chinese and Vietnamese neighborhoods would be much higher than in the French neighborhood, where buildings were distinguished between residential space, commercial activity, and administrative space. The building behind me, constructed in 1931, is a wealthier Chinese shophouse, with one floor on the ground for commercial activity and one floor above for residential space. More modest Chinese shophouses would have commercial activity on the ground floor and then several floors of apartments above. So the ethnically Cambodian community lived around the royal palace, sometimes literally in the shadows of its walls.
The contrast between European wealth and Khmer poverty was striking and underlined the colonial order of things.
While a royal capital and the capital of the French colonial protectorate, economically and demographically, Phnom Penh was in the hands of the Chinese community. This is perhaps best seen in the restored villa behind me, which once belonged to one of the city's wealthiest Chinese merchant families. As the French set about ordering and systematizing their colonial city based upon these racial categories, the question, are you Chinese or are you Khmer, took on a new significance and would later feed into the growth of a Cambodian nationalist movement.
Each racial or ethnic group was supposed to live in its own section of the city. In 1860s France, Emperor Napoleon III and his chief advisor, Baron Haussmann, completely rebuilt most of Paris. But such urban renewal schemes faced difficulties in terms of cost and resistance from local residents.
In the colonies, the government could behave in a much more authoritarian manner, confiscating land and levying taxes on people who had little or no recourse to challenge such measures. Furthermore, they could take advantage of the low wages or even forced labor of the colonial economy.
The French city planners funded their projects with taxes paid by their colonial subjects and approached the city as a tabula rasa.
Following the tenets of 19th century urbanism, the French established a grid system of streets at right angles to each other. They also built several very wide and very long north-south boulevards to facilitate the circulation of traffic around the city. The French built a canal that physically separated the European from the Chinese sections of the city.
For decades, a monstrous drawbridge divided white from non-white urban space. In the 1920s, the French colonial state set about another rebuilding of the major cities of French Indochina, tasking Ernst Hebrard, a trained urbanist, with making a new master plan for Phnom Penh.
He also started a building boom of official imperial structures, such as this train station, completed in 1932. And this police station, or commissariat, built in 1930, which after years of neglect has fallen into a very serious state of disrepair. The centerpiece for the new plan for the city was the Central Market, completed in 1937. This impressive structure combines both smooth Art Deco lines with a very smart use of high ceilings and ventilation, allowing for a much more comfortable interior environment in the tropical heat.
The Central Market with the Art Deco style is really open for ventilation. The light and the air can go freely inside the building.
Unfortunately, subsequent ground-level additions hide the true beauty of the structure. Hebrard left a distinct style in Phnom Penh.
He also rejected the more ornate Beaux-Arts style of earlier generations of colonial architecture in favor of this very clean and straight lines characteristic of the Art Deco movement of the 1920s and 1930s.
You can see the neoclassical styles from 1890 with the post office, and then you can compare to the Art Deco style from 1930s with the Central Market and the Central Railway Station.
Like the market, the train station had architecture that was much more open and free, allowing for light and air to circulate through the building, providing for a much more comfortable and livable environment.
By the 1930s, Phnom Penh acquired its distinct look and feel. When Somerset Maugham visited Phnom Penh in 1922, he wrote, "This is the ancient capital of Cambodia, but nothing remains of its antiquity. It is a hybrid town, built by the French and inhabited by the Chinese. It has broad streets with arcades in which are Chinese shops, formal gardens, and, facing the river, a quay neatly planted with trees like a quay in a French riverside town. The hotel is large, dirty, and pretentious, and there is a terrace outside it, where the merchants and innumerable fonctionnaires may take an aperitif and for a moment forget that they are not in France." While in the French Quarter, there were clear contrasts between the neoclassical and Art Deco architecture, the greatest distinction was between the French Quarter and the Chinese and Khmer neighborhoods to the south. One of the ironies of Phnom Penh's colonial history is that the colonial state created a style that most people now associate with Cambodia. When the French arrived in Cambodia, they were awed by the remains of the great Khmer Empire, but took a disdainful view of contemporary Cambodian culture. 19th century racial thinking declared the current Cambodians to have degenerated and lost the glories of their ancestral past. The colonial state decided to educate the Khmer about their past in order to save them from being swallowed up by the Thai and Vietnamese cultures to the west and the east. Part of this campaign was to have French experts establish an official Khmer style, a style that would be inscribed into the city. And they decided that the king should have a palace befitting of a French-backed monarch.
Unimpressed with the simple wooden structures of Udong, the French encouraged the court to move the royal capital to Phnom Penh and construct a large palace complex, including this elaborate throne room. Construction of the royal palace complex started in the 1860s and it was formally opened on February 14, 1870. There was further expansion of the complex in subsequent decades.
The royal palace complex was much larger than the former site in Udong and contained many grand and imposing buildings.
With its soaring spires and sparkling gold roofs, the palace compound was an impressive spectacle indeed.
The palace complex was surrounded by high walls made of stone and topped with ornate decoration.
The stone construction was important because the stone walls and also the stone structures in the palace complex served as a symbol of modernity in sharp contrast to traditional wooden architecture. The royal palace is full of various indigenous symbols, but also contains one very interesting Western symbol of royal authority.
This was originally an image of French Emperor Napoleon III. However, when he was overthrown in 1870 and the statue became politically incorrect, the new republic had to decide what to do with this royal symbol.
Someone came up with a plan to cut the head off of Napoleon and replace it with a likeness of the Cambodian monarch. One of the most incongruous items in the royal complex is behind me, currently undergoing renovations. This was a palace once used by the Napoleonic Empress Eugene during the opening of the Suez Canal. After the ceremonies, the French packed it up, shipped it off to Cambodia, and re-gifted it to the Cambodian monarch.
With the French authorities guiding the construction of the palace and adding the odd Western symbol or two, the complex was really a hybrid product of the colonial encounter. The hybrid colonial style could be seen elsewhere in the city, such as the French renovations to Wat Phnom. A site of traditional significance to the Khmer, the French renovated it in their interpretation of an authentic Khmer style. This included the anachronistic use of Naga images and lion motifs, not seen since the glory days of the Khmer Empire centuries ago.
The area to the west of Wat Phnom was turned into a park that became a favorite site for afternoon strolls.
One famous hybrid colonial creation was the Naga Bridge.
The French decorated this bridge with the official Khmer style, both created and endorsed by the colonial regime. One of the best examples of the French invention of an idealized Khmer style is the National Museum. Like its sister museum in Hanoi, the structure represents a number of French aesthetic choices rather than an accurate reflection of existing Cambodian architectural styles.
Here we see the colonial aesthetic at work. While the swan-tail finials were in common usage, the white column or tower on the roofline, lifted from traditional Buddhist stupa architecture, would not be used in a secular structure like a museum. When combined with European building techniques, such as square columns and even an Indian-style gate, we see the design was more a product of European Orientalism and less an accurate reflection of contemporary Cambodia. Nonetheless, the colonial authorities endorsed this style as essentially Khmer and authentic. The colonial era was thus important not only for the construction of French structures, but also the creation of a Cambodian national style. As in so many cases around the world, this act of creation fused the local with the imperial into a new phenomenon. Currently, the colonial era structures are disappearing at an astounding rate, provoking concerns about threats and also questions about preservation.
The pressures on the colonial building in Phnom Penh are real estate development, lacking of appreciation to the past, and then the condition of the building.
Others point to a lack of concern in the government.
So there are two main reasons why the built inheritances from the past, and in particular colonial architecture, are not conserved. The first one is the lack of a general political will to implement a heritage policy, and the second one is that many owners and promoters do not share a culture of restoration, so they prefer to renew the buildings or to build new buildings.
While demolition is one threat, remodeling is another.
While preservationists would like to see the buildings remain intact with few or no modifications, thus preserving the old colonial style, residents frequently make modifications to make the old buildings more livable.
How then is this cultural heritage to be preserved?
With the lack of political will to implement an overall heritage policies, in my view, there are two strategies which deserve to be enhanced in order to pledge for the conservation of colonial buildings in Phnom Penh. The first one is the strategy of promoters and architects who restore buildings for their own residence or commercial and tourist purposes. And the second one is the inhabitants' strategy to occupy, to inhabit, and to ensure the continuity of occupation of inherited buildings.
The Exchange Restaurant is an example of commercial restoration and repurposing.
Indeed, developers, concerned with cultural preservation, saved this structure 1 week before its slated demolition. The booming tourist industry offers another option.
I think colonial building should be marketed to the tourists, because this will make Phnom Penh really different, a huge difference between Phnom Penh and Bangkok.
But in this current construction boom, colonial-era buildings are not the only structures under threat.
While there's a rising concern for the conservation of colonial architecture, there's less interest today for the preservation of wooden houses as well as buildings built between the 50s and the 60s, mainly by Khmer architects.
Currently, there are some building projects that try to revive a colonial style using contemporary building techniques, with obviously mixed results.
Phnom Penh, the city at the meeting point of four rivers, is currently at a historical crossroads.
The French colonial era, so vital to the creation of Phnom Penh's look and feel, is in danger of being destroyed and forgotten. Unlike these documents, which can be preserved in the National Archives, when these buildings are gone, they're lost forever.
Faced with multiple threats and the constant political turmoil of the past 50 years, the future of Phnom Penh's colonial past is bleak, and much like the great Angkor civilization, which was mostly lost and forgotten for centuries, the French colonial past is likely to share a similar fate, as it is lost and forgotten to 21st century development and decay, thus becoming Cambodia's other lost city.